So let's see, are we lit up? We're lit up. Okay, so this first website, I think, is hosted by some kind of official Chinese government agency. It loads inconsistently, and when it does load, you kind of have to wait a long time for it. You know, it's sometimes a little bit maybe overly laudatory, but you can still get a lot of information about the history of the novel's production and reception from that. Now, this is a Chinese television series from 1987 that essentially runs through the entire 120 novels, chapters of the novel. It is subtitled into English. So if you have a good bit of time and you want a sense of what overall is happening in the novel, it's probably worth your while to go ahead and watch this. This is also an example of just how sort of culturally pervasive this novel is in China, right? I mean, essentially, like this 1987 television series was like the Chinese equivalent of something. I'm trying to think of like these hour-long soap opera dramas that my grandparents used to watch, like Dallas and Dynasty, things like that. So yeah, this is really infected pop culture as well in China. So I also have here a reading guide by Brian Van Norden at Vassar, which will give you, a brief sort of guide to some of the characters and some of the events in the novel. Just sort of help you figure out what's going on, who's related to who, and so on and so forth. We have as well a brief outline of the novel by Richard Smith at Rice. And finally, to give you sort of more general artistic context, this is a website hosted by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York on Qing Dynasty art. So, there's a lot on landscape painting. The essay on nature in Chinese culture will probably help you to understand the garden episode. So this is something I would definitely try to just do a quick click through if you have a chance. Okay, right. So, as for the music that you were hearing at the beginning of the class, this was Buddhist temple music from the Ming Dynasty. That's the dynasty just before this particular novel was written. This novel was written about a century after the Ming Dynasty had ended. The dynasty in which it's written, the Qing, is in some ways a continuation of things that have policies of the previous Ming Dynasty, but we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Now, there is a particular reason I wanted you, in particular, to hear temple music, religious music, right? Does anybody know what the three major religious/philosophical traditions of China are? Can anybody name them?
Buddhism.
Okay, Buddhism's one. Yep.
Confucianism?
Confucianism is another. Yes. Taoism, yes, is the third, not communism. Communism is actually, Chinese communism is actually officially atheistic. And indeed, when the communists came to power in the mid-20th century, they tried to suppress Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, the practice of these religions. But does anybody know anything about the character of any of these religions?
Okay, I know about Buddha himself.
Okay, what do you know about Buddha, Jonathan?
He was very peaceful.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Peaceful in any specific ways?
I believe he believed in doing good. What's it like? If you do good things will happen to you. Basically.
Okay. What you're thinking of is the idea of karma, right?
Yeah.
And to some extent, all three of these
Believed in reaching
believe in, pardon?
He believed in reaching enlightenment, didn't he?
Yeah, and how does one reach enlightenment if you're a Buddhist?
Meditation, right?
Meditation's part of it. It's certainly a practice that helps you get there.
Doesn't it like happen after you go through a certain number of cycles of reincarnation?
It can. Buddhists do believe in reincarnation and karma. Right? Buddhism is not native to China. Right? It first forms in India as a kind of offshoot of the ancestor religion of Hinduism. Right? Hindus believe that eventually, if you go through all the possible cycles of reincarnation, then you will reach some sort of salvation or enlightenment, right? You have to experience every possible level of existence first, though, and get it right. And then you get to be enlightened. Buddhists, on the other hand, believe that you can actually short-circuit the whole process and reach enlightenment in any station of life that you happen to be at. Now, you do this through rejection of worldly power and material things. So if you want to reach the state of enlightenment, the state that Buddhists call nirvana, and be removed from the cycle of reincarnation, essentially you have to reject the things of this world, right? So it is a religion that demands what's called asceticism, which is just a fancy Latinate word for rejection of worldly things. Right? Think, like a monk living in a cell on bread and water, right? That sort of thing. So that's the central tenet of Buddhism. Now, does anybody know anything about Confucianism or Taoism? Yes.
It was started by Confucius, and
Okay.
it was really analytical and based off of all of his writings.
Yeah. The founder of Confucianism is Kung Fu Tse, whose name is usually Latinized in the West as Confucius. And, Confucian tradition is a sort of scholarly tradition, right? Confucianism emphasizes study. It emphasizes social relationships. It emphasizes sort of finding your place in a larger social world, a larger social scheme, right? It's very, very big on ritual. Now, this is not necessarily, like, when we talk about ritual in the Chinese sense, right, particularly when we talk about Confucianism and Taoism, there's no specific God concept in either religion. Both get blended with traditional Chinese folk religion a bit, especially Taoism. But in a lot of ways, what you serve, what you worship, if you're following the Confucian tradition, is the prevailing order of things. And this is predominantly a social order, right? So the reason you study, the reason you cultivate the mind, is to become what Confucius called a junzi, or gentleman. So you master the arts, you master sciences, and you find yourself some sort of public post where you can do good, where you can work for the betterment of others. That's sort of the Confucian goal, right? You find a good ruler to serve and a good position from which you can affect, real good in people's lives. Now, you got there through a series of what were called Imperial Examinations. There's a series of books, the 5 classics, that you were expected to know, that you were expected to master. Right? There's the classic of poetry, self-explanatory, right? The classic of history, also, one should think, self-explanatory. The Book of Documents, another historical text. The Spring and Autumn Annals, which is sort of year-by-year chronicle of early Chinese history. And the I Ching, which is a kind of divination manual. Right? I Ching means Book of Changes or Classic of Changes. So you would spend, if you were a young man of good family, much of your youth studying these books, in addition to Confucius's own book, The Analects, right? The book of his little sort of pithy sayings. You'd be tested on them sometime probably in your mid to late teens, and how you did on that exam would sort of determine where you would then get placed in the imperial hierarchy. Right? So people did not attain high positions in government solely through birth. Right? It wasn't so much an aristocratic system. It was supposed to be a meritocracy where people of humble origins, if they were talented enough, could move up. Right? We do see some of this sort of thing in the novel. We'll get to it more specifically when we stop talking about context and start talking about the text, right? But yeah, ideally, Imperial China was a kind of meritocracy based on this Confucian principle that anybody could cultivate themselves into a gentleman, right? But Confucianism requires active self-cultivation. Right, an activity in the world. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of antithetical to the Buddhist belief, right? That you only gain salvation by rejecting the things of this world. In Confucianism, you accumulate good karma by doing the right things in this world. Now, what about Taoism? Does anybody know anything about Taoism?
Sort of.
Okay, well, what do you know about it, Ash?
I always thought it was sort of the polar opposite to Buddhism, much more superstitious and mystical, and like a lot of Taoists, I think, were alchemists.
Yeah, a lot of what we think of as traditional Chinese medicine actually comes out of Taoist alchemy. Yeah, so Taoism is associated more than the other two with folk religion, with magic, with alchemy. When we talk about Taoist alchemy, what we're talking about specifically is practices people would use to try to extend their own lives. Sometimes through ingesting various herbal concoctions, sometimes through weird sexual practices. The purpose always, though, was to extend one's own life. Now, this actually kind of runs against some of the things that Taoism is actually about, or seems to on the surface. Have any of you ever read the Daodejing or portions of the Daodejing? No. Okay, nobody? Okay. It's an incredibly cryptic and confusing book of poems that essentially tells you that if you are trying to be a Taoist, you're doing it wrong. You've already failed. So Confucianism, right, stresses activity. Right? You have to actively cultivate yourself to become a gentleman so you can do good. Taoism instead stresses passivity. Living in tune with or in harmony with nature. Right? Essentially, by not striving for things, by not exerting yourself, by living in harmony with the natural world, you accumulate personal power, or what a Taoist calls day. And all objects in the world have day. And I think this is sort of what's kind of behind the principle of Taoist alchemy, that if you consume certain other things, you consume some of their day. And yeah, you accumulate day by following Tao, which means the way. But it's not something you can do consciously. You can't suddenly wake up and choose one day to follow the way. If you do, congratulations, you've already fucked it up. Right? Back to the beginning. Start over. So, what we have in these three traditions, right? One more weird thing to note about this is that one of the reasons monotheistic religions like Christianity, like Islam, have never really caught on in China or Japan is that the idea that you can only be one thing seems to a lot of people in East Asia kind of weird and foreign. So what people typically do in their own lives is pick and choose beliefs and practices from among these various traditions for different purposes. For example, somebody might practice certain Taoist principles to gain particular things in this life, right? There's a particular Taoist ritual. It's called burning. People draw pictures of objects they want on what's called joss paper. And then they burn the paper, and then, supposedly that goes to the spirit world, and the spirits will get the message, okay, that this is something that I want or that I need. So people will do that, but at the same time will pay a Buddhist temple to say prayers for them when they're dead, because Taoism doesn't really have an afterlife concept, right? So these different religious systems fill different gaps in people's lives, and people tend to pick and choose based on what they need at any specific time. All right, so any questions about any of this? Which I promise is 100% relevant to this novel. Now there's one more specifically Taoist concept that we should probably discuss before moving on. Anybody recognize this symbol?
Yin Yang symbol.
Yep, it's called the Yin Yang, right? The white is the Yang, the black is the Yin. What's that?
Is it good and evil? something?
It's not really good and evil. It's not quite that simple. Does anybody know what the yin and yang sides of this each represent? What does yang represent?
Negative energy, I think.
Yin is generally that which is considered more negative energy, but not negative in terms of bad, right? Yin is regarded as feminine, passive, associated with night and darkness, wet, cold, those sorts of qualities. So, by contrast, what then is yang? Yeah. Yes, yang is the masculine principle. Active,
Bright.
yep, associated with day and brightness. Fire, heat, and dryness. So what do we notice we have contained within the yin side and the yang side?
Natural opposite.
Yeah, each contains some portion of its opposite, right? There's a little bit of yin here in the yang side of the symbol, and a little bit of yang in the yin side of the symbol. So what this symbol represents is a kind of ideal balance of forces. Right, too much yang or too much yin in any particular individual or any particular culture, any particular situation is a bad thing. Right, the two are necessary to balance each other out. Now, this is relevant in that in the novel we have two protagonists who are essentially counterparts for one another, right? A male and female counterpart for each other. We've got Jia Baoyu and Lin Dayu. And what do we notice about Jia Baoyu's behavior? What have you observed about Jia Baoyu?
He's hyper.
Okay, yeah, he's hyper. Hyper in what way? Like what seems to be heightened or hyper about him?
Whenever he interacts with women, he seemingly gets like super excited or becomes really excitable.
Yeah, he is very, very excitable. Gets angry quickly, right? He has a temper. Sometimes throws things around when he's mad. Right? Causes a stir wherever he goes. And what about his cousin Lin Dayu? What's she like?
Isn't she like really sickly and like frail and stuff?
Yeah, she's sickly and frail. Right? She's beautiful but ill, right? Obedient, quiet, easily hurt, right? So these two characters both represent different sides of the yin-yang balance, right? Jia Baoyu is sort of the more masculine, aggressive, explosive side. And Lin Dayu is the more retiring, passive yin side, right? Okay, any questions about any of this so far? Yeah, Ash.
So does that mean the novel is, since there are a lot of religious elements in it, like the reincarnation and stuff like that,
Sure.
is it supposed to be like an examination on these concepts, or is it just like
I think that's part of it. Do you mean is it meant to critique
not
some
critique?
of these concepts or?
I don't think really. Maybe critique, more or less like take bits and pieces of it and play with it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, these are all certainly used as elements of the plot and elements of characterization, and I think that there is, in fact, an implied knock at some of these traditions at various points, or at least the way they're often employed. For example, we know that Jia Baoyu has an older uncle, right, who has just sort of given up on all of his social responsibilities and family responsibilities and just sits around playing around with chemicals, right, trying to make himself into an immortal. So he's using Taoist practices to try to extend his own life and ignoring his family, ignoring his job. We also have this weird Buddhist monk with the scabby head who keeps running around pointing at people and giving them obscure prophecies, right? We have the Taoist and the Buddhist who are traveling together at the beginning, right? Impervioso the Buddhist and Mysterioso the Taoist, who pick up the stone and send it out into the world as a person.
Yeah, I was confused about that.
Okay. Well, let's...
Why is it?
Okay, well, let's talk about that then.
I can't question it too much because I don't know. It doesn't make sense. It's just weird.
Okay. There is a point to it.
Okay.
Thank you. I didn't
Yeah,
like the rock thing.
Okay, yeah, I mean, what we have, right, essentially, what is Jia Baoyu? Why is he born with a piece of jade in his mouth?
Because he's the reincarnation of the stone.
Yeah, he's the human incarnation of this stone, right? This brick that was originally crafted for what purpose?
To rebuild the sky, repair it.
Yeah, this goddess,
I didn't get that.
right? This goddess, Nuwa, made all of these magic bricks to repair the sky. And she made one extra that was sort of left over and cast aside. So Jia Baoyu is the outcast brick. Right. He was made to be part of the heavens, to be part of the sky, to be part of the sort of celestial hierarchy. But he wasn't used, right? He was just sort of left on this green sickness mountain
Maybe that's why he's so
to
angry.
lament. What's that?
Maybe that's why he's so angry. He just left.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, when they come upon the stone, right, it's not happy, right? It's lamenting. It's upset about its fate. So the Buddhist and the Taoist together slip the stone into this stream of souls of people who are about to be born, right? So that it too will get a chance to experience human life, right? To be a part of something rather than this sort of leftover piece of creation that was never used for its intended purpose.
Okay, that sounds better.
Makes a little bit more sense now? Yeah, and I mean, yeah, it is a weird beginning, right? It is a kind of strange way to start a novel. Certainly for us. And this might actually be a good place then to talk about some of the differences between a Chinese novel and a Western novel, right? We call a long Chinese narrative like this a novel because we don't really have a better name for it. It doesn't work in quite the same way as a Western novel. So when we think about a Western novel, and let's use things we've read recently as our basis for comparison. We think of like a novel like Orinoco or Candide, right? what do these narratives have in common? What are these narratives typically concerned with? What are they about? How long is the average early Western novel, based on your experience?
It's only like 2 pages, but like.
Yeah, they're usually relatively short. What sorts of characters do we typically see in a Western novel of the 17th or 18th centuries?
I like religious characters and then people representing their monarchies.
Okay, yeah, we have representatives from different classes, right? And maybe, Candide is a satire, so it's maybe a little bit unusual in certain respects. But most of the characters we see in a Western novel sort of resemble real people. Right? That is, characters usually are drawn from primarily the rising middle class, right? When we talk about the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, we're talking about a period in which the middle class of merchants and skilled professionals starts becoming more important than the aristocracy. They're getting richer, they're getting more influential, they're getting more important. And the novel sort of rises along with them. And the plots are usually more or less realistic. Again, Candide's a satire, so it's a little bit unusual. But yeah, we tend to stick in the realms of the realistic or the plausible. Now, a Chinese novel, on the other hand, is exceedingly long. Right? If you read the introduction to this, you know that the full work runs to 120 chapters spread out over 5 volumes, right? It's massive. It's longer than most Chinese novels, but not really by that much. So usually, the plot of a Chinese novel originates with some historical incident. But by the time Cao is writing, that historical incident is being replaced by some sort of mythical or fantastic narrative, right? So we have elements of fantasy in 18th century Chinese novels that we do not see in Western novels in the same period. This novel starts with, the weird Buddhist and Taoist running around with this talking stone that was cast aside when Nuwa remade the heavens. There's another narrative a little bit older than this one called The Journey to the West, which begins with the birth of a sentient stone monkey. Right, so definitely not so concerned with realism, right? Now the Western novel also tends to be plot or event driven. Right? This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Chinese novels have a more sort of associative logic.